I'm not picking on the Democrats, my Democrat friends, because Republicans have their own ways that we've screwed things up and not followed through or not implemented the law. But it was 6 years before we even had an oversight hearing when I came to this position and the gavel passed to the Republicans. I think we should just all agree you ought to come at least 2 times a year for this important exercise. So that's another example of a recommendation. I hope we can get bipartisan support for some of this, if not all of it. Bobby, with that, Mr. Scott from the first state, yield to you for such time as you would require.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to join you in mourning the loss of our colleague, Sheila Jackson Lee. The Budget Committee in Congress have lost a relentless voice for racial justice, economic justice, and the people of Houston, Texas. I know I speak for everyone on the committee when I say we'll certainly miss her presence. I also want to recognize the lives lost 23 years ago on 9/11 and thank the gentleman from New York for reminding us of the personal impact of the tragedy. We'll never forget the victims of that despicable attack and the heroic sacrifices made by so many on that day. So Director Swagel, thank you for being here. 50 years ago, Congress lacked the ability to independently analyze the president's budget and the fiscal health of the nation. Congress lacked the analytical capacity to independently assess any proposed legislation. And most importantly, the voters lacked an independent, unbiased source of budgetary information on the decisions made by their representatives in Congress. So the Congressional Budget Office changed all that. This thanks to the CBO. The Congress is no longer forced to rely exclusively on the executive branch for budgetary analysis and economic information. For 50 years, the staff of the CBO has provided indispensable guidance to Congress and to the Budget Committee specifically. Every year, you analyze hundreds of bills, complete thousands of requests for technical assistance, and release high-quality reports on our nation's economic and fiscal health. CBO has become one of the most effective and important sources of economic in the United States, and the work is respected not just here in Congress, but around the world for being accurate, unbiased, and nonpartisan. The success is only possible because CBO is independent. CBO delivers unbiased, high-quality information about the decisions we make here in Congress, no matter what party finds the analysis inconvenient. And you've upset members of both parties from time to time when you do your job. A lot of the information we like to hear, sometimes we don't. There are undoubtedly ways we can improve CBO and help support the agency, such as the Data Sharing Act that the chairman mentioned, passed the House on a bipartisan basis and the Senate last night, and is expected to be signed by the president. That bill will ensure that CBO has the data it needs from the executive agencies to keep Congress and the American people better informed about the decisions we make. Now it's time to build on that progress. There's another bill offered by the Senator from Michigan, Gary Peters, the CBO Data Access Act, which would provide privacy protections. However, as we consider any legislation, this committee should be careful to avoid weakening the independence that has made CBO so successful. Some House Republicans have long sought to discredit CBO because they disagree with some of its work, and they're not alone. Former President Trump's Project 2025 would dismantle the independent oversight, politicize career civil service jobs, and weaken checks and balances across the federal government. These attacks on civil servants and independent agencies are a dangerous path that we must resist, and we must resist the urge to criticize CBO when their analysis happens to be politically inconvenient, or we risk to undermine not just the CBO, but the Budget Committee and Congress as a whole. When we weaken our most valuable resource of nonpartisan budgetary expertise, we open the door to choosing our own facts and listening to special interests that have their own agenda. We can't allow partisanship to undo the progress we've made over the last 50 years to deliver unbiased analysis to Congress and to the people that we represent. So I want to thank you for the work that you do and the work that CBO does, and look forward to the discussion today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia, and now, in the interest of time, if any other member has an opening statement, I'd ask that you submit it for the record. I will hold the record open to the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not have yet prepared a written statement. Now, we recognize someone that needs no introduction. This will be your third oversight hearing. We appreciate you being here. You have very important work to do, and we look forward to hearing from you. So the floor is yours, Director Swagel, for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member Boyle, Mr. Scott, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify about how to improve the work of the CBO. And congratulations to all of you, and thank you to all of you on the passage last night of the Data Sharing Act. That will help us to support you better. And that's the job of CBO. That's my job, is to support you. So thank you for helping me do that better. So CBO, as you both said, was established to strengthen Congress's role in the budget process. We provide objective, nonpartisan information to support you, to support the committee, and to support others, the entire Congress. We aim to provide economic and budget analysis that is timely, rigorous, insightful, and clearly explained. My job, my goal, is to provide you with the information you need when you need it. Now, cost estimates are central to our role, and it's a key way we support the budget committees. Last year, we published estimates for 97% of the bills ordered or reported by an authorizing committee before they went to the floor of either chamber. We provide technical assistance, preliminary estimates throughout the legislative process. As legislation is drafted, as amendments are debated, throughout the entire process. Estimates of tax provisions are the responsibility of the Joint Committee on Taxation. So any legislation that changes the Internal Revenue Code, JCT provides those estimates, sometimes alongside our estimates. So the 2022 reconciliation bill had JCT's estimates of all the tax provisions. There are lots of green energy provisions, electric vehicles, and so on, and our estimates of drug provisions and other things. They're in our document, but that work is done by JCT. Transparency is a top priority for CBO. We do it in many ways. I'm here, I testify, and I'm happy to testify as many times as is helpful for the committee. We answer your questions, we talk to your staff, we publish reports, we have computer code on our website. We do comparisons of our projections with other organizations, alternative policies. We do lots of work to explain the uncertainty in our work. And then we consult with experts. We consult with experts from a wide range of outside groups and a variety of perspectives. And I welcome your input on who we should talk to. And it's extremely helpful when you say, hey, here's someone who knows something, we'll go to talk to them. And that's been extremely helpful from the committee and the entire Congress. Accuracy is a priority. The feedback from the hearing here, the previous oversight hearing here in January, helped us realize that we needed to update our economic forecast that went into our June budget update, and just to improve the accuracy of those projections. I'm working hard to get you more information, and more information on administrative actions is a key piece, and that message has been loud and clear from this committee. So our June budget update highlighted the budgetary effects of major administrative actions. The next Outlook report is, in January is most likely, certainly before the February 15th statutory deadline. We'll have even more. We'll have a table on administrative actions that significantly affect the budget, and we're doing lots more work, including at the direction of the chairman. We're also increasing our capacity to provide you with information beyond the 10-year budget window, and to provide more information on the dynamic feedbacks of policy proposals on the economy and then to the budget. And these are policy proposals both on the tax side that change the tax system and that on the outlay side, changes in spending. All of our work is released publicly, our cost estimates, our analytic reports. We have a quarterly report that lists recent publications and work in progress. Everything we do, all of our completed work is listed in our appropriations request. Our website has the releases in the coming week, but again, in response to your feedback, we've improved that. And thank you for highlighting where we need to improve. So we now list a schedule for the major reports coming out in the future. We've done much more. So I'll just finish by saying we are striving to improve the service that we provide to the Congress. I'm here to support you, and I want to do it as best as I can and get you what you need when you need it. So thank you again for helping us identify our priority areas and making us better positioned to support you. Thank you again, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Director Swagel. We will now move to the Q&A portion of the hearing. I'm going to take the lead here for 5 minutes. Let me start by saying, in my career in the public and private sector, and any segment of society where there's an organization, I have never seen one to thrive, succeed, and achieve excellence without a culture of accountability. And I read a great quote from Thomas Paine, who said, beware of people who are in organizations that aren't accountable or don't feel accountable, because if they're accountable they feel like they're accountable to no one, they shouldn't be trusted by anyone. I think that's true. And so I think it bodes well for CBO to have this dialogue and oversight. And we need it. And we all need accountability. So my fundamental and basic question is, who are you accountable to?
And thank you. So we support the Congress. Our first responsibility in the Budget Act is to support the work of the 2 budget committees. And then after that, there's a whole list of other committees. So that's number 1, is we are accountable to the Congress, listed in the order of priority in the Budget Act, starting with the budget committees.
So if Mr. Bobby Scott does a bad job representing the first state, the mother of all states, at least in his district, they'll throw him out on his ears. And so if I ask him, who hires you and who fires you? I think you would say, I don't put words in your mouth, Mr. Scott, but I think you'd say, the people of my district, the voters. So that's my question to you. If you do a great job, who gets to reward you? And if you do a bad job, who holds you accountable and metes out some consequence to that?
You know, if we do a good job, it's usually, sometimes we get thanked. A lot of times it just means things happen and there's not a problem.
Like that field goal kicker who never gets
that's fine.
recognized when he makes it, right?
If we don't do our job, then the Congress isn't able, you're not able to do your job as well as you want to. And I hear it. I hear it from committees. I hear it from individual members. And that's also part of the accountability.
Well, let me cut to the chase. I understand this chain of command to be such that you support all committees, and your customers are members of Congress, but that your board of directors are right here in this room, the Democrat colleagues of mine, my Republican colleagues, and that we have jurisdiction as a committee in oversight, not the Financial Services Committee, not Ways and Means. So I think that's an important basis to start this relationship is it is Congress that you support, but these are your board of directors that govern and have responsibility for oversight. What if you were going to change 3 things? I can tell you what I would do to change the congressional process. I would say we have to stay here until we get our appropriations done, and instead of shutting the government down, we should shut the travel of members of Congress down until we get our job done, because everyone else has to pass a budget and live by a budget, but we don't, and we let our folks get on planes and fly back, celebrate holidays, and meet with constituents. So that's one of many things. I've got a long list. What are your 3 things to improve how you provide timely and accurate information and advance your mission as CBO?
Yeah, I think my number one is shared with you. It's regular order. And so just have the process, the budget process, go back to regular order. We respond, to the way Congress works. We try to support you however you work. We're set up to do regular order. And so that's number one. There's a couple key areas that I want us to do more on. I mentioned some of them in my opening statement. Dynamic scoring, dynamic analysis is one. Prevention is part of that, longer term analysis. Our ability to work on healthcare, in instances the water level is always, my challenge is to keep the water level just below my nose instead of above it. So more resources, more people to work on healthcare would be another one. And then the other things I'd add on besides what I just mentioned is on the national security side. We do excellent analysis, working closely with the two armed services committees. I had to take down my hiring in that area in December 22, and I'd like to expand our work there.
I meant to get to the point where I could, in full disclosure to my colleagues, say that there hasn't been an audit in all the 50 years as we celebrate 50 years of the budget process in CBO. I think we ought to audit CBO, and not so we can go find something to beat you up about, but so that we can have an external review and an objective set of eyes on modeling and methodology and procedures and et cetera, in your organization. Are you open to that? I mean, every other agency gets audits. Are you open to that?
Yeah, so just to make sure.
And then I'm going to yield to my colleague.
Yeah, no, of course. I'll be fast. Our financial statements are audited. Our data security is audited in lots of ways, and we have lots of oversight. On the modeling side, the work we do involves many models, and so the way I would suggest you go about it is to pick some areas and say, CBO's work on, whatever it is, the impact of drug legislation and innovation. Well, let's look at that modeling, and there, we can talk more about what we've published a lot. We've gotten feedback. But more feedback would be fantastic.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Swagel. Ranking Member Scott.
Good, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Swagel, for being with us today. You talked about regular order. One thing that's out of regular order, a long time continuing resolutions. My district is home to the Norfolk Naval Station Norfolk, the largest naval base in the world. Newport News Shipyard, where we build nuclear aircraft carriers and submarines. And the continuing resolutions make it difficult for agencies and federal contractors to operate. Can you say a word about the recent proposal, which appears to be the longest initial continuing resolution in the last 40 years, and the impact it has on agencies and businesses trying to fulfill federal contracts?
Yes, sir. As you said, a CR instances means uncertainty, both for the federal agencies, including us, and for our counterparts, the contractors and other people who supply us, and for our employees. I'll tell you, from our side, we pause hiring, we wait on acquisitions, we sort of hold off on training and things like that. So the uncertainty is difficult. It also makes it difficult just for our substantive work. If we're doing the appropriations at the same time as major legislation, it's the same people, and there's just like it's a logjam within the agency of trying to support you.
And the businesses can't start can't do new starts, even though there's a regular construction schedule for submarines. They can't start a new submarine under a continuing resolution.
That's right. It poses challenges for the military, and I heard the Defense Secretary Austin talk about the challenges that it would pose.
And does this add to costs?
It could add costs over time if the work isn't done in the most efficient way.
Recently, CBO estimated budgetary effects on a lot of different things, including the cost of extending the expiring provisions of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Can you remind us how much you estimated it would cost and why it is so much more expensive than the original cost, and how it compares to outside groups that may be making estimates?
Okay, yeah, so by statute, we publish a report on alternative policies, things that are different than current law, including, as you said, the extension of the expiring provisions of the 2017 Act. The most recent report said that it was $4 trillion was the cost of the extension, plus another $600 billion in interest costs. That's if that were extended this year. It would be more next year because there'll be an additional year in the budget window. And the original 2017 Act, some of the provisions were permanent. There were also some revenue raisers that in some sense were one-off. The revenue from the international tax, for example, that's a one-off. It's not repeated. So that's why the cost, there's many reasons, but that's one type of reason why the cost of extension, is so high compared to the original estimate.
And how does your estimate compare to outside groups?
It's a good question. It's probably pretty similar. I know the Wharton, the group at Wharton does their estimates. I suspect on that it's pretty similar. It's expensive.
Thank you. You've provided information on situations like healthcare. The chair of Ways and Means request, you had a response in May about permanently extending the Enhanced Affordable Care Act tax credits, and you informed them on June 24th that if you did such an extension, 3.4 million more people would have health insurance each year. Can you explain to me how the extension of the tax credits creates more people with insurance?
Yes, and that's, again, it's one of the alternative policies that we've analyzed is the extension of the premium tax credits. Those provide additional subsidies for people to buy insurance through the exchanges established by the Affordable Care Act. They improve the affordability for people, and that leads more people to buy insurance. So that's the main way in which it increases coverage is by improving affordability. People who wouldn't otherwise buy health insurance then get covered, and as you said, it's in the millions. You said 3.4 million people.
And if we don't extend them, there'd be 3.4 million fewer people?
Who would be insured, that's correct.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank the gentleman, and now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Tom McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of Yogi Berra's celebrated observations was that predictions are hard, especially when they involve the future. And I think that's the fine point of the matter. We should have learned from the outlandishly wrong COVID projections a few years ago or the embarrassingly wrong climate projections that we mortals are not very good at peering into the future. And that's a failure I've watched with respect to budget projections over the 16 years of my tenure in Congress. We're not only terrible at making them, but we tend to use them to avoid making tough decisions in the here and now. That's the J. Wellington Wimpy School of Budgeting. I'll gladly give you $2 of savings 10 years from now for $1 of new spending today. If we focus on the present, on spending reductions and program reforms now, in the present, the future is going to take care of itself. But if we use the future as an excuse not to set things right in the present, no projection is going to protect us from the consequences. I've said this over and over. The only budget that matters is the budget before us today, not the budget that we might take up 10 years from now. This is a fantasy that diverts us from our responsibility right now. We also tend to focus on spending levels without much attention on how that money is being spent. Time and again, I hear appropriators boast that they've appropriated within the limits that we've set, and that's good. But there seems to be little interest in where that money's actually going, how it's being spent, and I'm constantly appalled to see where it goes. Hundreds of billions of dollars that take federal revenues and spend them on projects that exclusively benefit individual communities or politically connected interests or NGOs. Hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies that prop up failing businesses that can't make it based on their own merits. And unauthorized appropriations that are made in violation of our own rules and that routinely fund much of the government because our authorizing committees won't review the efficacy of the agencies that are under their control. Churchill said it best. He said, the farther back we look, the farther ahead we can see. And perhaps we should look back at how these programs were performing and why we keep throwing good money after bad rather than while we're trying to peer into the future. I think we'll find that asking these questions will put us on a much better road to that future. So much of our bold new ideas have been tried many times before. Kamala Harris's price controls, for example. I mean, we've been trying those since the days of Hammurabi 6,000 years ago, and they always produce a shortage of whatever's price is being controlled. So perhaps before we try the next bold new idea, we ought to first look back and ask how it worked the last 10 times we tried it. I agree with the chairman. Mr. Lopez is to be commended for reading the 1974 Budget Act. But, Mr. Chairman, reading the Budget Act is easy. Following it is hard. And that's what we failed to do under both Republican and Democratic majorities. And by not following it, we placed the nation's finances in a perilous condition. So I say again, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. Mr. Swagel, what I'd like to see us focus on is subsidies of every kind. The beauty of a free market is that consumers get to vote every day with every dollar they spend on what the economy will produce, what prices they're willing to pay, who best produces it. Subsidies distort those price signals. Robbing St. Petersburg to pay St. Paul. Projects that exclusively benefit local communities ought to be paid exclusively by those local communities rather than robbing their neighbors. Unauthorized appropriations for agencies whose authorizations lapsed years ago, and yet we still keep shoveling money at them without asking if they're even still relevant, let alone effective. And let me now pose to you, what would you add to this list?
No, I was going to say that's something we're working. I'm not sure. The unauthorized appropriations is a really hard one. We have an annual report. We have a project to use, some of these large language models, AI, to improve that, to match up authorizations to outlays, the authorizations in language. So
Well,
that's what we're
I'd like to see a focus from your office
Yeah.
on what we're spending, subsidizing interests of what we're doing that is diverting national resources to exclusively local interests. And again, the agencies that we have failed to review and yet keep shoveling more money toward.
Okay, understood. No, thank you.
I thank the gentleman from California and now yield to the gentlelady from Vermont and our new ranking member. We're being taken over by Democrat ranking members.
Yes, it's an interesting morning, isn't it, Mr. Chair?
Ms. Becca Ballin.
Thank you so much. Dr. Swagel, thank you so much for coming to the Budget Committee this morning. On multiple occasions, you've had the opportunity to discuss with us in-depth research done by your team at CBO, and I truly appreciate your commitment to evidence-based policymaking. As a former state legislator, I know how important that is. As you may know, Vermont has faced back-to-back summers of devastating flooding. We were hit really hard last July, and we're still in the process of recovering when another devastating storm rolled in almost to the day from the storms last year. And FEMA declared both of these events major disasters. And sadly, there are thousands of Vermonters who are still waiting on assistance from FEMA for damage to their homes, their properties, their businesses from last year's flooding, and some who have been flooded now 2 years in a row. Climate change is clearly putting a strain on FEMA's resources, and FEMA has recently implemented what's called the immediate needs funding, which means FEMA is so low on funds that it has to pause paying for certain past disaster recovery projects so that it can focus on life-saving and life-sustaining activities, which of course we support. We want to make sure we're saving lives in real time. But what happens then is the folks who are struggling day to day to put their lives back in order don't get the immediate funding that they need to do that. And towns in Vermont, really small towns, Vermont is a very rural state, you've got these tiny towns in Vermont who are really crushed by the costs of recovering from these flooding episodes. So, you know, I'm frustrated because we have a situation where Republicans in Congress have brought to the floor what I see as another unserious government funding proposal. It doesn't meet FEMA's funding needs. I really urge them to come back to the table so we can reach a bipartisan agreement and a responsible agreement to fund the government, because climate change is coming for all of us, for every congressional district. And rural is rural, whether you're rural Vermont or rural Kentucky or rural Ohio. These tiny towns are not going to be able to withstand the financial burden of building back. So I'd like to take this time to highlight the importance of fully funding flood resilience. Dr. Swagel, according to the Congressional Budget Office, is it actually cheaper to pay for flood mitigation projects than to do nothing? Like, am I reading that right based on your report?
That's right. We put out a recent report showing the increasing prevalence of the kinds of natural disasters you highlighted, and then provided, you know, a range of policy options, you know, such as to put the money in up front and mitigate versus, you know, paying people after.
And so I understand the challenges of needing to pay that money up front, but it's so clear that we are paying much more down the road when we don't invest in these mitigation projects. Can you highlight for us what the impacts, you know, from your office's perspective, what will be the impacts of climate change on the federal budget over time, especially if we don't make these investments up front?
Okay, no, thank you. And I'm going to focus on housing and the natural disasters you mentioned. We're doing a range of work on this, including relationships between climate and health, for example.
Yeah.
I'll focus on the natural disasters. We had a report recently. It was at the direction of Representative Waters in the Financial Services Committee, connecting climate, flooding, and housing. And increasing flooding, increasing hurricanes, tornadoes is affecting the housing market. There's a federal cost because the federal government's on the hook for so much of the mortgage industry. We support the mortgage industry. It's also affecting discretionary spending. You mentioned FEMA, that's discretionary spending.
Yeah.
And then it's affecting homeowners because the private insurers are pulling back. They're raising rates, they're reducing coverage availability. That affects current homeowners. It affects future homeowners. You can't get insurance, you can't buy a house. And so that's what we looked at, is, you know, connecting these things together.
And I see that I'm short on time. I'll just close by saying that it's absolutely essential work that we do, that we have to do in a bipartisan manner, to pass appropriations packages that include funding for the Disaster Relief Fund. Because as I said, this is not particular to any state. This is coming for all of us. So thank you so much, Dr. Swagel, for being here. I really appreciate what you always bring to the committee.
I thank the gentlelady from Vermont, and now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Glenn Rothman.
Which one?
Yield 5 minutes to Mr. Grothman. Oh, is he? Oh, Mr. Grothman, we'll come back to you. I'll yield 5 minutes to my friend, Mr. Smucker from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Director. I think this is an important hearing. I think to the chairman's points, the CBO was initially established to provide information to the Budget Committee and then to Congress as a whole. So certainly there's an accountability here, and I think examining the outcome or the outputs and examining the effectiveness of CBO is important that we do that. So I appreciate you holding this. I'd like to just briefly have you describe to us, Director Swagel, you know, we're calling next year like sort of the Super Bowl of taxes, and there's going to be a lot of discussion, a lot of proposals in regards to extending provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and other areas of the tax code as well. You'd mentioned joint tax provides revenue estimates, and then you use those estimates. Could you talk, as we go into that debate, could you talk about how CBO and joint tax interacts, who's responsible? Just give us a little bit more of what that looks like. I think it's important for everyone to understand that.
No, sure thing, and thank you for asking. So anything that changes the Internal Revenue Code, the estimates come from JCT, and they show up in our cost estimates, but it's entirely their work. In the future, as we update the baseline, then it's our responsibility to update the baseline. So for example, the electric vehicle tax credits, the initial estimate was theirs. It turned out that the number of dollars, it quickly became apparent that there were many more dollars involved than had been in JCT's estimate. We updated the baseline. It happened that they redid their analysis, and we just took their updated analysis in our baseline. So it's an example of shared responsibilities working together. I'll just mention one other one quickly on healthcare, where the tax and the outlays are so interconnected that our health teams work very closely and fruitfully together. So for the most part, we stay out of their lane for sure. Health is one where the lanes tend to merge.
I think we're all particularly interested in not only the tax provision itself, but also the impact on individuals' behaviors, on business behaviors, and sort of the macroeconomic, how will this affect revenue going forward? I think is going to be a really important part of the discussion over the next year. Can you talk about that? Does CBO, does joint tax look at the macro? Is there one particular agency that is responsible for that? Talk us through that.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so in the sense in which we're both doing that analysis, our macro teams talk to each other, but there's a sense in which we're doing it separately as well. Anything that's in a cost estimate, it's whatever they say, that's what's going to be in the cost estimate. We have to do the analysis ourselves as well because we have to think about the baseline in the future. And so, say there's legislation in 2025, in 2026, we're going to have to update the baseline and think about, well, what's the effect of whatever's enacted on future growth, on future revenues, and that's why we do it as well.
So you do, and joint tax does dynamic scoring, essentially?
That's right. I mean, instances where there's House rule requiring dynamic analysis, dynamic scoring, they would respond to that. We would be doing our own analysis, but they're the ones who would do the official response.
How, one of the purposes of this is to examine the accuracy of CBO estimates, and of course, we're going to be interested in joint tax as well. How well do you think CBO does on future estimates? And we've talked about other organizations that we may look to as well that may have a slightly different outcome. How would you say CBO ranks? A lot of people looking at the same information and scoring it and coming up with different outcomes. Tell us, how well do you think CBO does?
I think we do pretty well on the whole. And of course, there's some areas where we're going to do better, we're going to do worse. Instances, our analysis sometimes can be different than others because of the nature of what we do. We have to work comprehensively. And I'll just use an example, our work on say, student loans, where other organizations don't have access to the same data we have and don't have to think through, if we change the provisions of student loans, well, what does it mean for the labor market in the future? What does it mean for benefits and things like that? So in some sense, we have more information, better information. We do a different kind of analysis than, say, the Wharton group would do. Their work is excellent. It's just different.
Yeah, I'm out of time. I wanted to ask one additional question, which I'd love to get to sometime. Like, are there constraints on your organization that would prevent or that would result in changes with other organizations? And are there changes that you would suggest we make to help you be more accurate? But sorry, I'm out of time.
Go ahead.
I'll answer quickly.
Give him a
Yeah.
quick response, please.
No, and it's something I'd like to come and talk to you more about that and get your feedback. We're working more on the dynamic scoring I mentioned, on longer term analysis. We want to be faster. The challenge is, getting the comprehensive information you need. We interact with other groups. Well, with Wharton in particular, we have very fruitful interaction with them, and I respect their work more. So let me, if it's okay, I'll come back and give you a more fulsome answer and get your feedback.
I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Now you have 5 minutes to our friend Tom Swazi from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Swagel, thanks so much for your time today. So I was reading some of these materials. I don't know much about this stuff, but you've got about a $270 million budget. Is that right? No, I'm sorry, a $70 million budget, about 270 employees.
That's right, you got it.
$70 million budget, 270 employees. How many reports do you write a year?
So we do nearly 1,000 cost estimates and then dozens of reports.
And what are some of the biggest ones you've done over the past 5 years, let's say? What's like the big ones?
The big ones. On the cost estimate side, it would certainly be reconciliation. The Build Back Better that passed in the House was, I don't know, probably hundreds of pages. On the report side, there's things that we've done. I'm trying to think, we have a report on hypersonic weapons, which is very long and very detailed, comprehensive. And I feel like it made a big impact because of the quality of that report.
And what about the tax bill? Would you say that, was there a report you did on that, the 2017 bill? I know that's more than 5 years ago.
We did a report in April of 2018. That was our analysis of the dynamic feedback of what we expected, the sort of changes in taxes affect the economy, feedback to revenues. That was back in April 2018, what we expected. It's something we're working on now and consulting with academic experts. I expect us to have more on that in the future, but that's an example of we did it, sort of almost in real time. We need to look back, and we are looking back.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea to address some of the concerns that the chairman is making, which is just look at some of the big reports that have done, especially those that are about projections. Mr. McClintock was talking about the projections and things before. Look at them over the past, whatever timeline you want to look at, 5 or 10 years, but especially the big reports, and then look back and say, how did we do? How did our projections compare to what actually happened? So that instead of, this becoming a partisan thing where people are saying, oh, we're just trying to stop you guys from doing what you do, and the other says, oh, they're just picking on you because they want to be. Let's just let's pick some important reports that have been done in the past, and let's compare your analysis that you did over the past couple of years on some of these big reports, and then compare it to how it actually turned out. And that would be a good learning lesson for you guys as to, why did things change? And you're never going to be 100% right, obviously, but how'd you do? And there could be a debate about, why was it good? Why wasn't it good? As opposed to, I like an audit thing, I'm all for auditing the actual office, like how you're spending your money and stuff, but the auditing the results may be a very bureaucratic, ineffectual thing to do. I think more of a, this is our big reports, maybe the committee could pick some big reports, and then say, okay, how did you do on this? And then you do an analysis, this is how it turned out to be accurate, this is why it wasn't accurate, this is why it turned out to be accurate, this is why it turned out not to be accurate. Some things change in real time that change the results. And then that would be a good way to show how effective your agency's being. I think that might be a good idea. But, I think that the concern is that this, like everything else in Washington, D.C., is everything becomes politicized. And so, I know you've struck me as being a very serious person who's very dedicated to your craft, who wants to do the right, very smart, very diligent, wants to do the right thing. But like everybody, Democrats and Republicans, I get frustrated with the bureaucracy, and I get frustrated with the, well, just give me a direct answer. Can't you just tell me the direct answer? So let's set up a process to look at reports over the past 5 years or decade, whatever we want to pick, and pick some reports and say, okay, how did we do in our projections? And why did it come out the way it did versus what we projected, and why didn't it? I mean, that's what I think it might be a good idea. All right, thanks so much.
Well, I shouldn't use the balance of your time, Tom, but let me say I'm open to that. And I would suggest maybe my Democrat colleagues could find a handful of big reports that they've struggled with in terms of not playing out in a significant way, not a small way, in terms of what was projected and what the projected and the actual outcome. And then we can do 3 or 4 on this side and then dig in. And I agree with you. I'm not talking about auditing the results, but the inputs, the assumptions, the procedures, the tools, software, so that we know we have the best tools available. So, but I'm in agreement with you, Mr. Swazi, on that. Let me now yield to Mr. Glenn Grothman from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you one more time for being here. Kind of our most regular guest, huh? Very good. In 2022, CBO estimated that the Inflation Reduction Act's climate-related provisions, mostly tax credits, would cost about $400 billion. They have since revised those projections upward from $400 billion to $790 billion. So in other words, you missed by about a factor of 2 to 1. Can you describe how CBO went about making these revisions, and how could you have an error so big?
Okay. No, sure. So those estimates appeared in our cost estimate. The original work was from the JCT staff. And then the revisions were the first revisions, we just took their work directly, and the increase you said. It's a great illustration of the challenges involved with this. The JCT, right, was working with the 2 tax writing committees over an extended period as the industry was changing. So in some sense, right, there's stability in estimation that they try to get, but the industry is changing, and in some sense that's part of it. The administration implemented the law in a way that was different than, in some sense, was embodied in the estimate, right? There are income limits.
Could you explain that? Yeah, just how do they do it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the law had an income limitation to get a tax credit for electric vehicles. In effect, the administration said, well, if you lease instead of buy, then you can, the income limitations don't apply. So in some sense, it's almost like if you fill out the paperwork in a particular way to buy the car, then, and so there are things like that that is just, this is difficult. It's just a difficulty of the process. And the suggestion that we heard before and from the chairman about looking at how we do it and maybe how we do with JCT, that sounds.
Could you kind of say that if money is available by the government, people will change their behavior to get that money?
That's right. That's right.
Wouldn't that be true again? And here's one that just happened to come across somebody's desk, and we're saying it missed by a factor of 2 to 1. But I would think that almost at all times when the government is giving away free money, behavior changes to get that money. Think that's true?
That's right, and we try to think ahead in our estimates. And student loans is an example where we have to model, when the president does something, administrative action on student loans, we try to figure out, okay, what are colleges going to do in raising tuition to capture that money, or students will borrow more, and so we do our best to get at that.
Okay. In your June 2024 baseline, you revised the 10-year projected discretionary spending upward by $900 billion. This adjustment was made because Congress approved $95 billion in temporary aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. On the face of it, does it make any sense to assume that this temporary emergency spending, I assume we better not have the war in Ukraine going on 8 years from now, does it make any sense to assume that temporary emergency spending will continue on and grow through the entire 10-year budget window on the face of it?
Right. So, what you described is exactly right. It's exactly what we did, and we did it because we're required to by statute. We look at it in the same way you do and say, well, this looks like it's one-time money. By statute, we're required to extend it.
I have a bill in my hand.
I knew that. I knew that was coming. So.
Right. Congressman Case and I introduced a bill, Stop the Baseline Bloat Act, which would remove emergency spending from the CBO baseline. You think that's a good idea?
You know, we will do it however is best for you.
I know you will, and you're
Yeah.
such,
So,
so
yeah.
accommodating. But do you think it's a good idea?
You know, one of the things about my job is I don't want to tell you if it's a good idea or a bad idea, because I just want to tell you what it will do. If it provides you with better information, we will do it. And actually, can I just say one more thing is, we will do that now. So sometimes members will ask us to do it in different ways. We publish reports with different ways. So we can do it now, but if the Congress wants it, wants it to do it differently, we will do it.
Okay, so it doesn't bother you if we change the law, and it'd probably make things clearer for Congress what they really think the future will hold, right? You'd say that makes
No,
no sense, no sense.
Right.
To have what is hopefully a temporary war, hopefully these are all temporary wars, to pretend like it's a permanent thing.
Right. No, I agree with you. There's this one.
Good, we'll stop right there. Agrees
I agree
with
with you.
Congressman
Period.
Groth.
I'm done.
Just quit where you're at.
I thank the gentleman from Wisconsin and completely endorse the reform bill to make it a much more sensible and accurate projection going forward by pulling out that emergency spending. We had, okay, so we're going to go to the pride of Kansas, Mr. Ron Estes, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Swagel, for joining us this morning. And we've discussed in several hearings and conversations throughout the year, I mean, all of us in Congress appreciate the role that CBO plays in helping facilitate our work. And as we've talked about as well, we also know that we want CBO to do better in terms of the results. And it sounds like from some of the comments earlier from some of my colleagues and your responses is, to some degree, maybe it's JCT's fault, the Joint Committee on Taxation's fault for some of these things that, we're literally making trillion-dollar decisions, whether and if the revenue estimates from a tax policy like TCJA aren't accurate, or if the cost provisions from an inflation act doesn't pan out the way it was. And if it's off as far as it might be, those policies and statutes may never get passed through that process if we have the right and accurate information. And as I talked about major pieces of information, as my colleague Mr. Grothman already mentioned that the energy and climate provisions in the Inflation Act were estimated at just under $400 billion. And however, that's gone up in terms of your estimate, plus actually even from the get-go, it was rated higher. Credit Suisse had a double amount from the beginning. Goldman Sachs had, $1.2 trillion. So obviously there's others out there that have estimating models that work that seem to be more reflective of what the actual numbers come in. And I go back to, like in reality, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I mean, the actual cumulative tax revenue through Q1 of this quarter that has come into the federal treasury has actually equaled what CBO's and JCT's estimates were before TCJA was passed. And so we're still reaping the benefits of that economic growth that came out of TCJA. And so it's really a struggle as we sit here and making decisions. So we want to make sure that we're getting the best information, the best estimates to make that happen. I know I'm talking with my colleagues and we're working on some ideas. And one of the things, I guess, just as another area we talk about is executive actions. Can you talk a little bit about how the CBO currently accounts for executive actions in your baseline and what you do there?
Oh, okay. No, thank you. And, I've gotten that message loud and clear from you directly, from the chairman, from, many members of the committee, that you want more information on that. It's a challenge for us because we evaluate the law, as it's written, as we understand it will be implemented, and then the administration does something, takes an action that we didn't anticipate, that, maybe we couldn't anticipate given the statutory language. We update the baseline and try to provide you information as quickly as we can on it, and we're going to do more in the future. There's sometimes when the administration will put out a proposal, a preliminary rule, but is not final. And so working together with the budget committees, our procedure now is to put that in the baseline at 50%. So we say it's gonna, whatever, cost $100, we put $50 in the baseline. So it gives you some information, but we know we're gonna be wrong, because if they finalize it, we're too low by 50, if they cancel it or the Supreme Court cancels it, we're too high by 50. And so it's we're trying to figure out how to get you the right information, but it's something I want to work with you more on to figure out, well, what's the best way to help, to support you.
Yeah, that's, I guess, the bad part is you're always going to be wrong. I mean, if you pick a 50% and you put in $50, and because if it was one way and $100 and the other way is zero, so you're being set up to not be successful through that. I mean, and maybe some of our conversations earlier sparked the point of, JCT when they were talking about some of the international tax provisions that are being talked about by OECD. They prepared 2 or 3 different alternatives of what could happen based on those different scenarios and assumptions. And maybe that's something that CBO should look at as well in terms of if it goes this way, then this would be the impact or the other. I think that would allow better decision and discussions around what actually does get implemented. I know I'm about out of time, but my colleague Drew Ferguson and I are working on some legislation to help with that executive action idea that I talked about, and trying to figure out how do we address some of the spending that comes out of that may not be accurate in terms of, or may change what the estimates are. So we're looking forward to getting the best information so we can make the best decisions on these areas that we cover. So thank you for your time.
No, thank you. I look forward to working with you and the chairman and the committee.
I thank the gentleman from Kansas, and now yield 5 minutes to my friend from San Diego, California, Mr. Peterson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony today, Director Swagel. The CBO has provided Congress with objective, nonpartisan analysis to support evidence-based decision-making for 50 years now. And we depend heavily on you and your office to provide us with a common set of facts that we can use to debate and make decisions. You don't just crunch numbers and make budget projections, though. You're transparent about how you conduct your analysis and economic modeling. This is your second time testifying before the committee this year. When your staff and advisory panels don't have enough information to inform your analysis, it's our experience that you come to us and ask which experts you should speak with. And as you testified earlier today, you and your team handle remarkable workload. Thousands of congressional requests for technical assistance, hundreds of cost estimates, dozens of reports and other publications each year. And last time you testified here, you told the committee that you needed about 285 employees to fully serve Congress, and at that point you had just under 270. Can you remind me how large CBO is relative to the Government Accountability Office or the Congressional Research Service? And if we increase your statutory requirements under law, do we also need to increase your resources?
Yeah, so we're about half the size of CRS, and then GAO is about 10 times our size.
Right. And if we increase the statutory requirements under law, like, you're obviously going to need more resources.
We need to expand. And in some areas like healthcare, we're just always you're always understaffed. And so,
Thanks. And I understand the concerns and critiques of my colleagues on the committee, but I think we have to also make sure that we're giving you the tools that you need for us to get the product that we want. One of the other problems we face in Congress when we make investments in infrastructure, healthcare, national defense, we only evaluate the impact of that spending generally in today's money. We don't account for the benefit of future savings from those investments. No family in America would think to say, we can save $5,000 by not fixing the roof this year without knowing that this next storm will mean really big damage to your furniture and outlays that could be well exceed that. But that's not how we do it here. That's what we do. Earlier this year, the committee and the House voted to pass the Preventive Health Savings Act. That directs CBO to estimate and provide the long-term, that's a 30-year budgetary effects of preventative health care services at the request of this committee's leaders. And while Senate action on Dr. Burgess's bill would be a good start, the long-term budgetary effects still can't be used for budget enforcement. Mr. Director, you and I have previously discussed the feasibility of adjusting long-term budgetary effects for uncertainty and making them enforceable when there's sufficient data. In addition to a directive from Congress, what analytical tools or technical capabilities does your agency need to conduct more long-term analyses and provide statistically valid uncertainty adjustments?
Thank you. And it's something that we're pushing hard on. Maybe if it's okay, I'm going to start with a specific example and then talk briefly about the general point. We're working to analyze a proposal related to treatment of hepatitis C. So it's intravenous drug users get infected with the virus. 20 years later, about 80% of them have very serious liver problems. 20% of them, basically, they clear the virus on their own. And that happens 20 years down the road.
Right.
So the 10-year window is just mismatched, and so we're working to evaluate that. Of course, we're going to provide the 10-year information. At the same time, we're working to provide 30-year information because the savings will increase. You spend money up front, you save money in the averted cost down the road. We're going to provide both, and then it's up to the Congress, to the Budget Committee first, but the Congress more generally, how to use that, and then just the capabilities. It's combining our health people, our macro people, our labor people. What does it mean for the labor market? What does it mean for the overall economy? And so those are the kinds of capabilities I would look to add.
Right, I think, the chairman and I and other members have been engaged in an effort to try to figure out how do we corral this national debt and get our country on a sustainable path. I think we want to do it in a realistic way. The other thing we've talked about is diagnostics, new diagnostics like whole genome sequencing. What are the benefits down the line of knowing that information from maybe a baby? And obviously, the data is going to be hard to aggregate, but if we're going to be realistic about what the true cost is of something, we have to understand kind of what the benefit is down the line. I appreciate your effort on that, and continue to work on it, and hope that you'll be upfront about the resources you need to help us be successful. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from California, and now yield 5 minutes to our friend and vice chair of the Republican Conference, Mr. Blake Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an important hearing today. Dr. Swagel, thanks for being here again. We appreciate the interactions we've had. We know that the CBO plays a critical role in the legislative process, so I think it's an important opportunity for Congress to provide that needed oversight over CBO's operations and analysis so we can work to improve the accuracy of CBO's products and analyze CBO's relationship with JCT and OMB, which I think is particularly important heading into next year's tax expirations. I think we've talked a lot about that. We have 7-8 years of data now for some of the very similar tax provisions that we would hope to be able to reauthorize and move forward. And so we can take a look at hard data and how some of these things actually affect the greater economy. The last time, Dr. Swagel, that the CBO released 3 baselines in 1 year was 2019. What prevents CBO from returning to that timeline?
No, you're right. It's in some sense the deviation from regular order and the pace of congressional action, sometimes the lack of pace of congressional action on appropriations in the budget, that's what in some sense plays havoc with our ability to do these baseline updates.
What benefits would come to Congress if CBO returns to being able to release 3 baselines per year, and what challenges would CBO have to overcome to return to releasing those baselines a year? Again, understanding our appropriations process, which is a complete mess, which is part of what the chairman and the ranking member want to be able to get control over with the process changes needed here. What benefits come if we can get back to that 3 baselines a year?
I think the key benefit is we would support you better. We'd get you more information and in some sense better timed because you'd be on a regular process, we would. I'll tell you, to answer the question, a key challenge for us, it sometimes can be the timing of information from the executive branch, right? The president's budget, has not been released by the statutory deadline. We get information from the executive branch on the actual spending for the prior year at the time of the president's budget. So when the president is late, that affects our ability to update the baseline for the spring.
Yeah, honestly, we also need to be able to look at this internally and figure out, are we going to actually stick to a fiscal year, or are we going to continue to have these hiccups? And I would argue that my colleagues on the other side of this building, the Senate, needs to understand that they've got to be able to put things on paper sooner. The House does a much better job, at least, of trying to pass appropriations bills on time. As you know, Dr. Swagel, switching gears here, reducing improper payments is a priority for many members. The Budget Committee passed my bipartisan Enhancing Improper Payment Accountability Act back in May to help address many of these issues. Could you speak to what CBO currently relies on to evaluate improper payment rates in government programs?
No, thank you. It's challenging for us because we have to look at generally at the executive branch, which doesn't always do the most, the greatest job at figuring out their own improper payments.
That's well said.
I'm trying to be polite. And then GAO, of course, does a great job at looking back. It's not their fault. It can sometimes take them time to get there.
What changes to policies around the production of and access to government data would help outside researchers and CBO itself to better estimate program integrity ROIs?
Yeah, so that's, in principle, we have, by statute, we have access to the data. Sometimes it takes us time to work it out with the executive branch. The legislation, that was passed last night from this committee, this passed by the Senate last night, will help us. There's a change to the Privacy Act, essentially giving us the same treatment as GAO, the same ability to get access to data as GAO. That would help us as well.
To what extent have outside researchers helped or hindered your work over the last several years? To what extent are you taking into consideration a lot of that information that they provide?
Yeah, it's the evaluation by outside researchers and the contributions is really helpful. I'll give you one example. I mentioned the work we're doing on hepatitis C. There's a group of academics who had been doing research on this instances before the president proposed his program. And we're not exactly using what they're doing, but they really showed us a pathway to do it analytically that seems like a good pathway. And so it's an example where academics are basically just helping us instead of just lighting the way for us to follow.
Excellent. Thank you. You go back.
I thank the gentleman from Utah, and now I see I've got a couple Republican colleagues left, and we are going to go to Mr. Greg Lopez and save Mr. Chuck Edwards, who is on appropriations, for last. So Greg Lopez, our colleague from Colorado, I yield 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Swagel, thank you for joining us. I see that you've been with CBO since 2019. I have read the law from 1974. And today I'm going to focus on my questions on accuracy. So would you agree that the responsibility for all the final products of CBO rests solely on CBO, which ultimately falls on your shoulders?
That's right. I agree.
So in 2019, CBO overestimated revenue by $12 billion, underestimated spending by $3 billion, and underestimated the deficit by $31 billion. In 2020, CBO underestimated revenue by $312 billion, underestimated spending by $202 billion, and overestimated the deficit by $110 billion. In 2021, CBO underestimated revenue by $614 billion, overestimated spending by $250 billion, and overestimated the deficit by $864 billion. In 2022, CBO underestimated revenue by $497 billion, underestimated spending by $303 billion, and overestimated the deficit by $194 billion. CBO in 2023 overestimated revenue by $477 billion, underestimated spending by $564 billion, and underestimated the deficit by $1.4 trillion. This happened since your tenure. Who's responsible for these notable errors?
As you just said, all the products of the agency are my responsibility. And actually, just one more sentence on this. Instances these, the numbers you listed are things I've thought about. And I've gone through each of those years, 21, 22, 23, to think about, well, why was it different than what we projected? And is there some lesson? Is there something we're doing wrong we need to fix? Or is there something, the administration did something I could not possibly have anticipated? And then, sometimes it's not, it's not for me to fix, but for me to understand. So I can go through each year, but just to say it's something that I think about as instances.
So we're in agreement that ultimately all the products CBO fall on your shoulders.
I agree, yes.
So when was the last time CBO updated its software systems? And how often does CBO update its modeling or software?
Yeah. So, our work is generally, it's a collection of different approaches and different models, so that will differ by different topic. So, as an example, our Social Security modeling, we're in the process of updating it now, removing from Fortran to Python, for example. So, no one's learning Fortran today. I learned that when I was in high school. Everyone's learning Python or Java, so we're updating that. So it's just a mix as our ability and as our budget allows.
Okay. So in recent years, how much of CBO's budget has been allocated to modernize efforts, technological updates to ensure it has the necessary tools to do its work?
Most of our budget is people. So, around, it's like a high 80s, 90% of our budget is people, and then technology is the next piece. There's a certain lumpiness to it. We've had, basically we had a couple years where we couldn't afford to update some of our computer hardware, routers, some of our, the desktops and laptops. And so this year, we've put a lot into that. So there's a lumpiness to it, but it's 10% or less of our budget.
Okay. So as I mentioned, I want to follow up with Mr. Chairman's question in the beginning as to who do you work for? And so as I look at the budget of the Act of 1974, are you familiar with Title II, Congressional Budget Office, Section 201, subsection 4? Are you familiar with that?
No, you'd have to read it out. I don't, I wouldn't know offhand.
Okay. Well, I would encourage you to always keep a copy of the law on your desk. Let me share with you what it says. And I quote, "The director may be removed by either house by resolution." That means, Dr. Swagel, that this committee is meant to serve as your oversight committee. And so when we ask you to come and come before us, and I think it's important for you to be coming before us more often, because we are the oversight committee. And again, we want to help, but these accuracy or inaccuracies prevent us from doing our job. So I caution you that we must have the right information in order for us to be able to do our jobs correctly, and recognizing that there is in the law itself that we are the oversight committee. I would hope that in the future, you are more clear and accurate in your projections, because the baselines is what the federal government relies on as we move forward.
Great. No, thank you very much. And it's something I agree that that's our goal, is to get you the information you need when you need it, and for it to be as accurate as transparent.
So let me ask you this. If you had an employee that for 9 years was providing you with documentation that was not accurate, what would you do?
Last question, Dr. Swagel, would you give him a quick answer, please?
Okay, of course I will. I'd want to understand why, what's going on. Is it, again, is it systematic? Is it, this year is one thing, next year is the other thing? That's the kind of questions I would ask at the start.
Okay.
I thank the gentleman from Colorado and yield now 5 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Chuck Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Swagel, thanks for being here today. I certainly agree with Mr. Lopez's point that we need to invite you here more often. I think we're going to do that. I do appreciate that. Every time we've invited you, you've been here with no resistance at all. And I look forward to a more productive, thorough, detailed dialogue on how we can dial these projections down. One question that I have that I'm particularly interested in this morning is, your office estimated that the IRS's 87,000 new attack dog agents funded in the IRA would bring in $2.9 billion in fiscal year 23 and 7.8 in fiscal year 24. But according to the Economic Policy Innovation Center, it's only brought in $160 million and $360 million respectively. And I know that Congress makes huge consequential decisions based on, and Congress makes huge consequential decisions Sometimes that are controversial to the American people. I can't think of one that has been more controversial. But because there's such a difference there, what can you tell us would be some of the reasons that we had such a difference?
No, thank you for the question. And it's something I've focused on a lot, in part because when we made that estimate, the executive branch criticized us as we didn't understand how much money they were going to collect, that they're going to get so much more than we thought. And one of the challenges we faced was getting information from the executive branch, from the service, the Internal Revenue Service. Well, what will you do with the money? Because that affects our modeling. There's customer service and there's enforcement. And of course, if you answer the phones, you can get more money, but they're really different. Like the dollar return from customer service is just lower than enforcement. It doesn't mean any one is more important or the other, but it's just different. We could not get them to explain to us what they do with it.
So, thank you, Mr. Swagel. What I think I hear you saying is that you were counting on information coming from the Biden and Harris administration for you to make these projections, and you did not get what you wanted, or they provided you wrong information?
It's, the information they gave with this issue, in some sense, was aspirational, that they aspired to, hit these targets. But we said, well, okay, how many dollars to this, how many dollars to that? We essentially had to just not decide on our own, but say.
And so you counted on Harris and Biden administration to give you the numbers that they needed to sell this to the American people? That's what I think I hear you telling me.
They said, well, we asked the executive branch, how will you implement the law? If they can't give us the information, we have to give you an answer. And here's our projection. And so we say, well, here's how we think they might do it, and go with that.
So you took the administration's word on what they thought that they would capture by adding 87,000 IRS agents to the IRA.
On this one, we didn't, because we couldn't, they basically didn't give us clear information, so we developed the split of the money into the different functions of the service. We developed that on our own as the basis of our projection.
Okay, so I'm going to back up just a minute. I thought that I heard you begin your answer with you're counting on the Harris and Biden administration to provide you this information. Yes or no?
Yeah, we asked them for it.
Okay.
That's right.
And was it their projection that they would collect $2.9 billion and $7.8 billion?
No. That was, as I understand it, I think the numbers you said were from our projection. They had a much more optimistic projection.
All right. What was their projection?
We basically have 2 to 1. You put $1 in, you get $2 of revenue back for net. Their multiple is much higher. I don't remember exactly what their multiple was.
So what level of confidence did you have in their projection, and how much was that weighted towards you coming up with this obviously erroneous projection?
No, we do our work independently. So, we're aware of their criticism that we're not optimistic enough, but we didn't take that into account.
All right. Mr. Chair, I see I'm out of time, but this, to me, feels a lot like when you go get an appraisal on a home, and the first question is, the appraiser asked, how much is your contract for? And let me work my way back to that. It seems a lot like that with far greater consequences. So I yield back. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you, Mr. Edwards, and I now yield 5 minutes to our colleague from Virginia, Mr. Bob Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director, for being here again today. What are your thoughts on the CBO having an audit? Not one's been performed in the history of the CBO. Why not? You've obviously not been the director for 50 years, but why not? Has it never been done? Why hasn't it been done in your tenure? What value do you think it might bring, or what opposition might you have to it?
Okay. So
I'm sorry, I'll just interject with, as we continue to discuss, hey, we're not as close as we'd like to be in our projections. Last year was the worst year with $1 trillion being off. So in light of that and the trend to be off, so
that's right.
go ahead,
Okay.
sir.
Okay, no, very good. I'll be brief. That on the financial side of what we do, of course we're audited every year, and we do very well. Our data security and data management is inspected, generally by the agencies that provide us with data. On the auditing of our substantive work, which I realize is where you're going, a lot of our work is in substance of different modeling. So we'll have different modeling on the revenue side or different modeling on the pharma side. And so it's not like there's one model to be overseen. There's priority areas. And that's what in substance, the way I think of this is I would want to get from you your priority areas, and then let's drill down and say, well, what do we get right? What do we get wrong? And why? And understand it.
Side note, from a cost standpoint, what would you guesstimate, what's the average salary of your 270 employees?
It varies. 2/3 of our employees have a master's or a PhD, and so their compensation would be, like a senior executive service, which would range, it's basically like 140 is the bottom of the senior executive service range.
Your costs are roughly 260 grand per employee. If you took your total budget and divided it by employee.
By the employee,
What are the other major contributing factors beyond the salaries piece?
It's technology is part of it. We're basically people and software and computers. We have some money for things like training and most of the travels associated with training, publications, things like that. Kind of more administrative or support. But it's basically we're mainly people, and then we're things associated with technology and data.
It's my understanding that when it comes to the cost of a proposed rule, we're assuming a 50% of the costs in the baseline. Is that correct?
The particulars matter, but that's a rough, the answer is.
What's the rationale for presuming half of it versus,
So what we do.
like the student loan transfer scheme?
No, exactly, the student loans.
The latest one being 132 billion, and we presumed then 66. So help me with why,
that's
the
exactly-
rationale for that.
Yeah, no, it's exactly the right area to use. What's happened is the administration has put forward proposed rules, but they haven't finalized them yet. So when they put forward the proposed rule of something like that's, a change, we say, well, it's not final yet, so it's not in the budget, but we want to provide information, and that's where the 50% comes in. And then when it's finalized, it goes to 100. If the courts reverse it, which of course, as you know, has happened, repeatedly with student loans, then it goes to 0.
A lot of more executive actions more recently, this administration, previous administration, and one before that. But talk about just assessing the costs or including the costs of these executive actions, the approach to that.
So there's a lot of them. When they're finalized, we put them in the baseline, in the budget. So student loans altogether since 2021 is over $500 billion, like 570 billion. That's in the baseline, we reflect it. There's other things, the thrifty food basket, what was done with that, together with very high food inflation, that's in the hundreds of billions. So it takes us time to analyze these things. As we analyze them, we inform the committee, we inform the Congress, and we put them into the budget baseline. And just one last thing is, sometimes a committee will come to us and say, we have legislation to reverse regulation, and then that generates a cost estimate. So it's not just in the baseline, but it's a cost estimate.
An adjustment depending on what that congressional action would be relative to that rule.
Right, the savings from that action.
Mr. Chairman, my time's expired. I yield back. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman and now yield to Mr. Burkeen. Are you prepared to speak? Just wait. Do you want to skip and come back? Okay. Mr. Ben Klein, also from Virginia. I yield 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was inspired by the remarks of my colleague from Virginia. So I want to thank Director Swagel for being here, for coming back. The CBO plays an important supporting role to Congress, forecasting long-term budget outlooks and scoring legislation to determine its fiscal impact. But like everything else in Washington, CBO needs oversight and reform to counteract Washington's deep-rooted culture of needless spending. For instance, one good reason for today's hearing is that a very important year for tax policy is just around the corner, and we must ensure that CBO is prepared to make accurate projections for the many policy proposals being considered, as well as their fiscal outcomes. While some of the fixes that need to be made may be derived from internal process reforms at CBO, others may involve reforming the statutory requirements imposed on CBO by Congress to resolve these ongoing problems. So Director Swagel, the baseline that CBO is required to produce is often described as reflecting current law, but that's not really accurate, is it? Could you describe the deviations from current law that are built into the baseline?
Very good. And we talked about administrative actions a minute ago. There's others that with programs that have trust funds, Social Security, for example, by law, the baseline is required to provide the numbers as if Social Security benefits are paid even when the trust fund is exhausted. And so that's a deviation from the law.
And compared to a theoretical baseline that's calculated without these assumptions, does the official baseline assume outlays that are higher or lower?
It would generally be higher in the example of the trust funds that are going to be exhausted.
And what about revenues?
Well, on the revenue side, we're required to include current law. And so the expiration of the provisions of the 2017 Act in 2025, the baseline shows a jump up in revenues because that's current law.
By more than 20 trillion over 10 years, right?
That's right. It's a big jump up.
So as CBO itself has stated, CBO's baseline is not intended to be a forecast of budgetary outcomes. Rather, it's meant to provide a neutral benchmark that policymakers can use to assess the potential effects of policy decisions.
It's a benchmark, and in some sense, you highlighted this asymmetry between the spending side and the revenue side. The revenues just follow current law, whereas in some ways, big parts of spending deviate from current law. So it's a benchmark. It's not neutral between spending and revenue, but it's definitely a benchmark.
That was my follow-up question. Given the distortions that CBO is required by law to incorporate that make spending and revenues appear higher than they would be under actual current law, the baseline is not actually a neutral benchmark.
Yeah.
And would you agree that improvements could be made to existing law to enable CBO to produce a more accurately neutral benchmark?
Okay, no, very good. I'll say one improvement I've made is deleting the word neutral from our budget reports. So you will see, we describe it as a benchmark and not a neutral benchmark.
Well, but wouldn't you agree that maybe in addition to what you do, that producing a neutral benchmark would be a goal that that members would find helpful?
I do agree, and we do already do it both ways. That with Social Security, we do provide information on both scheduled benefits and on payable benefits. So that's an example. Some members prefer it one way or the other, but so whatever information is helpful to you and your colleagues, that's what I want to get to you.
Okay. Well, I've got some legislation that will help you to achieve that,
that's
that
great.
neutrality. So I'll look forward to working with you on that, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia, and I yield now 5 minutes to our colleague from Oklahoma, Mr. Burkeen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you setting this up. I appreciate committee staff. I think oversight's one of the things that Congress, state legislative bodies across the country so lack, and I appreciate any time we get a chance to do oversight. This is the real work. It's what our institutions of government in a true republic should look like. I think it's really interesting. I've been guilty of not accurately portraying how you're placed, Director, with the CBO. I mean, you are designed to be bipartisan. You're picked, by the Pro Tem of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, and then the Budget Committee, of course, with the Chairman and Ranking Member on both the House and Senate side. You're placed, and so this committee's opinion on your work plays into the chairmanship and Ranking Member's views, and it's such a good model to make sure that there's a bipartisanship that is. So that we get to the truth, and wherever those facts lead us, that's pronounced. It's not leaning one way, whether it be Republican or Democrat. How do we, in addition to the way that you're
selected, how do we make sure that within within the 200-plus employees of CBO, how do we make sure that there's no ideological lean, that we go where the facts lead us, we pronounce that, and no one is trying to bring in things that would be, designed to skew facts?
No, it's a, it's a key to the organization, and it's something I think about a lot. It's those people and processes. I'll talk, if I can, I'll talk briefly about those, right? We hire people who can do the work in a nonpartisan basis. I mean, someone who comes in as an advocate, as a partisan, would be very unhappy at CBO because our people are mission-oriented, and then our processes are set up basically to reject that approach, that we have the kind of review process within the agency that is fact-based and analysis-based and not advocacy-based.
And that's great. I'm a big believer that, at the top of any, whether it be political or business, you give it 2 years with somebody in charge, and the culture underneath that person totally will change, and you'll see a difference there. Is there a cultural expectation under your leadership among, even those second in command and third in command, that if you catch people operating on a partisan basis, say, look, on your own time, that's great. But here, among the culture we have to operate, for the integrity of this, of what we're supposed to be doing, that's not acceptable. Is that culture cultivated?
Yeah, yes, it is, and I agree with you. That's my responsibility. It comes from the top. And we have a set of guidelines that our staff are not allowed to participate in partisan activities.
Okay. I want to shift to something that this committee, and I have the good pleasure of getting to hopefully see it advance, is modifying the, when a rule coming from a cubicle under the administration, I like to use that term because I think it shows so many people's opinion of decisions made from cubicle, where most of us really believe in Article 1, Section 1, that all legislative powers be vested in the Congress, not bureaucrats. But nonetheless, we find ourselves in a place where bureaucracy is able to pronounce rules. These come with a cost, and CBO provides a 50%, because you don't know if there'll be a CRA, Congressional Review Act, that might repeal that, or whether or not it's going to go into effect. And ultimately, it's either going to be underestimated or overestimated at the 50% mark. The measure that we'll be advancing is designed to that you within CBO will no longer pronounce a cost unless that rule is finalized. And then if it's proposed, that rule you would do an addendum that would say, if this thing is enacted, this is the cost. What are your thoughts on trying to clean up the inaccuracy of overestimating and underestimating with that change?
It's something that we've worked on with the Congress and the budget committees in the past. I am happy to revisit that because we want to provide you with the information that's useful to you. I'll just mention one more thing, which is there's some things that are just routine, important but routine. The subsidy rates for school lunches. There's a calculation. Department of Agriculture does it. We don't put that, when they put out the preliminary numbers, we take that at 100%. So things that are routine, I think we should just continue to do what we're doing. But it's the major one. Student loans was mentioned.
Because I've got 10 seconds, I want to ask you a quick question. You mentioned student loans. The Supreme Court twice has struck down the administration through an emergency order doing that. Yet that's been built in. There's been a cost. Can you quickly speak to how an executive order that's been struck down comes with hundreds of billions of dollars of cost that we've seen realized? How is that possible in the system of government supposed to be adhering to the rule of law?
Now, it's a challenge for us because the administration will finalize a rule. OMB decides what's in the budget numbers, and we follow them. So they finalize the rule at the end of the fiscal year. They say, okay, this changes the deficit. We reflect that. Then the Supreme Court overturns it, and then it gets reversed. So it's they're following the procedures we're following, but it obscures the information that you have to look at. So I agree. It bedevils us, and if there's a way to improve what we do for you, I want to do it.
I yield, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman and now yield to Mr. Rudy Yocum for 5 minutes from the great state of Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and to Director Swagel for being here today. Director Swagel, I would also like to begin by thanking you for both your and your team's continued engagement with my office and with this committee. In this committee, we have continually discussed the important role that the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, plays in Congress. CBO is critical to ensuring that we, as lawmakers, are informed as possible when making decisions. In order to have the best information possible, the CBO needs to ensure that the information it gives to lawmakers is unbiased, accurate, and timely. CBO's current baseline assumptions assume that one-time emergency or supplemental spending will continue annually. For example, the National Security Supplemental Package we passed last spring totaled $95 billion. This was a one-time supplemental package. However, CBO's baseline assumes that the $95 billion package will continue each year, totaling almost $1 trillion over 10 years. I understand that CBO is required to make that assumption, but do you think that that assumption artificially inflates the baseline?
It inflates the baseline, for sure, in the way that you said. So we can make these, so we can provide information in lots of different ways, and whatever way is most helpful for you, that's the way I want to do it.
Yeah, I do strongly believe that this assumption is inaccurate and inflates our baseline and thus incentivizes us to spend more in a time when our debt and deficits are completely out of control. I think we need to be incentivizing less spending, not more spending. And this is why I'm a proud co-sponsor of Mr. Grothman's bill, the Stop the Baseline Bloat Act, which requires the CBO to remove, and certainly understand, Director Swagel, you're following your statutory obligation here, but want to require the CBO to remove the assumption that supplemental emergency spending will continue annually from your budget baseline. This would create greater exactness in the budget baseline. Director Swagel, in several of our previous conversations, we have discussed the importance of accuracy at the CBO. As you know, CBO has had some substantial misses in their scoring and projections over the past few years, including a $1 trillion underassumption of our 2023 deficit. A substantial factor in the deficit underestimation was the Biden-Harris administration's never-ending stream of costly executive orders. How have you adapted your models to ensure greater accuracy this year?
It's really a challenge that we face when they do something that says we don't anticipate, and sometimes we could not possibly have anticipated it. We're working hard to get you more information faster and to update the baseline as quickly as we can. And it's something that the chairman and I have talked about, and we're working on. So it's still a work in progress, but that's my commitment to you, is to get you more.
Thank you. And how much have the Biden-Harris administration's executive orders added to our deficit this year?
I'm hesitating because the student loans is so in flux, because the courts have paused something.
Let's just assume for a moment that all of the Biden-Harris executive orders go in and the courts and everyone allows this to take place. How much would the Biden-Harris administration's executive orders add, assuming the courts allow them to all to take place?
This year, it's the, on the student loans, there's the income-driven repayment rule that's been paused.
Just give me a rough number.
Yeah, it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars.
Hundreds of billions of dollars
I
of
can't-
net new added spending just because of their executive orders, which go against the United States Constitution, because we have the authority and the power of the purse, not the administration. Which of the Biden-Harris executive orders are most expensive?
So I'll mention a couple. Student loans is the biggest. I mentioned the Thrifty Food Plan. That's big. On Medicaid, there's a rule about enrollment that basically quickens enrollment, so increases the cost. That's over $100 billion. There's state-directed payments, where a state can send money to a particular facility, and that's in the tens of billions. I could go on, but those are
But the number one issue, well, which one was number one?
it's student loans.
So the illegal student loan
loans and then-
unconstitutional transfer scheme, because this is not student loan forgiveness, let's be very clear. This is a transfer of student loans from those who took those loans out to the people who did not go to college and are working and paying taxes today. I don't think it's fair that people in my district who did not go to college, did not take out a student loan, should pay for the student loans of doctors and lawyers. Thank you, Director, for being here today, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Indiana, and now yield 5 minutes to our friend from Texas, Chairman Dr. Michael Burgess.
Thank you, Chairman, and I apologize for being in and out. Typical Washington morning, we've got 3 hearings in 3 different buildings. So it's taxing, but, and I apologize, Director Swagel, if you've already answered this, but the question of an internal audit of the CBO, has there one been done?
Okay, so on the financial side, you know, our spending, yes, every year. On the data security side, you know, yes, several by the agencies that provide us. The discussion we've had is focused on particular models, and that's where I would say, you know, we should be looking at areas of congressional interest and your priorities. You know, we don't have a single model, we have a collection, an archipelago of models.
Excuse me, if I could, but every federal agency under the Chief Financial Officers Act of sometime in the 1970s is required to perform a financial audit. We only recently got the Pentagon to comply with that 25-year-old law. Are you under a similar requirement at the CBO?
You know, we do one every year, and so, and, you know, we pass every year. So actually, I don't know offhand if we're required to, we do, but we certainly do it every year.
Can I ask you to share that with my office, because I don't know that I have seen that. Let me ask you this. On your website, you talk about a panel of health advisors that holds periodic meetings, and the CBO solicits their views between meetings. But no detail is provided on the precise role of the panel in reviewing the CBO's model on healthcare policies or specific estimates. Can you cite specific, well, first off, what are the responsibilities of the panel of health advisors?
Okay. I mean, it's really, they advise us that we go to them on areas of congressional interest, things that we're thinking about, and ask for their input. I can, if you will, I can give you an example. They're meeting on this Friday. And so the agenda will be on our website. Staff from the committee will be at the meeting. We have a session on technology, on new technology, a session on preventive health, the long-term effects of preventive health. And this is in response really to this is your legislation. And so we're asking for input from our academic advisors. And then we have a session on vertical integration and what the impacts of that, of, you know, sort of hospitals acquiring physician practices and things like that. What does it mean for medicine and for the budget?
So is it possible to know who is on this panel of health
Oh,
advisors?
absolutely. I brought the list with me. It's on our website.
Okay.
I'll give it to you after the hearing.
So would you support codifying the panel of health advisors, providing appointment authority to the 4 corners of the budget committees and yourself, the CBO director, as well as specifying its role and responsibilities in making technical recommendations regarding CBO's models?
Yeah, so I support getting your, information from you, from the committee, your colleagues, names on who we should talk to and experts with information. And you've done that. I mean, the healthcare task force within the committee has been enormously helpful for us on, say, the pharma side and others. The challenge with doing it with the panel is that I would hesitate to make that political. It's experts, it's non-political, and I would worry about, instead of just moving it even inadvertently toward the political side.
Well, we're in a political environment, that happens. But it was difficult as the chairman or the leader of the health task force on the budget committee, it was difficult to get, thank you for that. Those were good concepts. I'm glad we were able to move them along, but it was extremely difficult just to get them to a point where we could move them along, because no one really seemed to know who was doing what and who was in charge. Another thing that surfaced during all of that, the Biden administration, we're hearing a lot about it now in election season, political again, and they talk about how much money they've saved with negotiating prescription drug prices. And yet, there was concern from a number of us, are we going to reduce the number of new products that are available? The Congressional Budget Office originally came up with a pretty low number, then you revised that down to one new drug that wouldn't be developed because of the parameters of the Inflation Reduction Act. And yet every other expert, and we had a hearing, a roundtable about that, every other expert said, no, the number is dramatically larger, and it significantly negatively affects the ecosystem of drug development for other things as well that you wouldn't necessarily would think initially would be initially linked to the blockbuster drugs. But that's the kind of problem that we need to be able to deal with. I mean, your figures were vastly different from every other expert in the field.
So it's something that we've gotten feedback from, and we have adapted our modeling in response to the feedback. I can go into more detail, but in terms of the reason I think our numbers were different than the industry is that we analyzed the law, the Inflation Reduction Act, the 2022 regulation bill, as it was written, and the people on the outside who were analyzing it in some sense saw a slippery slope and said, look, you start here, and then it goes further. And they were analyzing, that, which is totally understandable. It's just different than what, our responsibility is.
The problem is, it's not a simple, you place those kind of restrictions, and it's not like, oh, we can develop this drug in less than a year's time. No, you can't. I mean, it's 10 years of pipeline easily. It's 10 years and $1 billion to develop a new drug. That's the problem that I don't think the CBO was taking into account, the length of time in the pipeline for the development of these projects.
We're going to have to leave it there. I know you all have an open line of communication. Thank you for your service as chair of the Healthcare Task Force and acknowledging that that's been helpful to the entire process in your operation. Now, to bring us home from the Palmetto State, Mr. Ralph Norman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Arrington. Thank you, Director Swagel, for being here. Let me just stress, I'd heard other members talk about before you give a forecast, get all the costs. I think it was in here that we talked about the cost of illegal immigration and the 20 to God knows how many are now in this country. And I think you mentioned it was a negligible impact or maybe even a positive. And it didn't take I've been to the border, as many have. We saw the medicine, we saw the airline flights that we're paying for going back and forth. And I wish, going forward, we would take everything into account and put as much effort into it to figure out all the costs and not, and let the facts show where they are. It's going to be a tremendous impact on this country that it's going to be hard to recover from, to be honest with you. But I hope and I would suggest that you get on not just immigration, but anything, look at the true cost so that when the CBO gives its blessings, that it has all the facts, just like we do in the business arena and hopefully we'll do in this political arena at some point. Director Swagel, do you agree that more regular and routine hearings before the Budget Committee would ensure that CBO is accountable to our committee and to Congress?
Yes, and I will come as often as the committee wants.
Okay, so you would agree that more routinely scheduled hearings would assist you and your staff in making sure the estimates are right and making sure that it's more efficient.
That's right, and working on the priorities that you and your colleagues have.
And likewise, how would requiring regular hearings before the Budget Committee assist the CBO in addressing the challenges it faces as you receive data on information and complete your work?
Yeah, I mean, it would be the prioritization, hearing what's important to you, and then getting feedback. If you say, look, we're missing something, and as you said, our initial analysis did not have what's happening at the state and local level in the detail that you wanted, and it's something we're not there yet, but we're going back to work on it. So getting that feedback is very important. Yeah,
and I just suggest to you, anything we do up here has direct result on the state. The state's created the federal government, not vice versa. So it has a direct impact. And the illegal immigration has got the greatest impact of dollars that I've seen since my 6 years up here in Congress. If you were
in our shoes, what changes would you say are critical to modernize the CBO?
I mean, the regular feedback is number one, and getting your priorities, making sure we're working on your priorities, getting you the information you need when you need it, and just getting us that feedback and oversight.
What's efficient and what's inefficient, in your opinion as director?
I mean, the challenge we face is the same one as you do, the gap from regular order. And, of course, we're going to face it again as we go into next year, but that's really the challenge we face, is getting our work done. In a sense, whatever legislation comes in '25, whether there's reconciliation or whatever comes, if the appropriations are still hanging out, then getting those done together is a challenge for us, as of course it is for the Congress as well.
The last time CBO released 3 baselines in 1 year was in 2019. Is it feasible for the CBO to return to this practice?
I want to, and again, that it depends on the workings of the Congress. Back to regular order, be good for our ability to support you.
How does CBO prioritize the rank and file bills for which you produce your cost estimates?
That is a challenge for us, very much. We prioritize the bills coming from the committees of jurisdiction. Both the chair and the ranking member, but the health team works first on the priorities set by the committees of jurisdiction. It means we provide service to all members, but not as much as we would like or as members would like.
Well, ultimately, it gets back to people. And how do you recruit and get people? And when's the last time you had to let somebody go? You've been director how long?
I've been director 5 years. There are people who have left the agency, for these sorts of reasons, performance reasons.
Have you had to fire anybody?
I have, yeah. I mean, obviously, I don't want to go into the particulars, but
I'm not asking for names.
If someone's not performing, we have a process to deal with that, ultimately leading to someone
so,
separating.
Like if they're not doing the job, you feel comfortable in firing them?
I do, and I have, yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you for appearing.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman from South Carolina, and now yield to my friend from Texas, Mr. Chip Roy, for 5 minutes.
I thank my friend from Texas, the chairman. I appreciate the time. I appreciate the director coming here to address the committee, and I appreciate, and I have to state on the record, the willingness always for the CBO director and his staff to be available anytime we ask. And I've never had a problem with that, and I'm greatly appreciative of that responsiveness whenever we're reaching out to your office. And along those lines, I mean, and I think I actually want to know your views on this. This is something that is, I want to highlight that in 2018, CBO published a document called the Budget and Economic Outlook 2018 to 2028 that I'm sure the director and staff are familiar with. And in that document, there was a table that compared CBO's economic growth projections from TICJA, from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, to projections made by other organizations, right? From Goldman Sachs, IMF, Moody's, Tax Foundation, other things.
Yeah.
And so, and that table, you can't see it, but it's in there. You guys can look up, the table's in there. And it's interesting, right? Because it's got CBO that sort of pegs the GDP impacts, right? 2018, 2022. There's 2 organizations that were higher, and there was 5, 6 that were lower, right? So it's not a statement about CBO or anything about the numbers. I'm just saying it had some comparative data that was helpful, because you look out and you go see, okay, well, that's what these other organizations think. But question, I am unaware of and have not seen any such table, for example, and it's not a pointed question. It's actually trying to flesh out in terms of oversight options that we could have. I've not seen a similar table on the so-titled Inflation Reduction Act. Has anything been produced by the CBO that has a table that shows, okay, here's the impact of the so-titled Inflation Reduction Act versus other entities?
You haven't done exactly that. In the June budget update, we had a discussion of how the numbers have changed, but we didn't compare. We didn't compare them directly to others, but implicitly, others. At the time that JCT estimates came out, others said no, it's going to be many more dollars. So we didn't do that comparison directly, but we said, oh, it's going to be many more dollars.
Well, I think this is what I'm trying to get at, in terms of timing, and I don't have the exact timetable right in front of me of every time an entity came out and did one. But I do think it's important, right? So when the IRA's subsidies and funding were estimated to cost $391 billion at the outset by CBO, I think, is that correct?
Yeah, something like that, that's right.
And so, and then that what allowed proponents of the legislation to claim that it cut the deficit, right? That was a statement about how the Inflation Reduction Act was sold.
That's right. Now, of course, as you know, the scorekeeping guidelines meant, that those revenues were not in the, in the cost estimate. I mean, they were on the page, but they didn't count in the official score. But of course, we knew that people, talked about those together.
But now we would say that would score higher, that it would expect to increase the deficit, right?
It's in the baseline, and taking the resources away from the service, by the scorekeeping rules or the guidelines we follow would be in a score.
To the tune of $700 to $800 billion.
It depends on the particulars of the legislation, how much the resources are taken away. But there would be a revenue loss. Taking away resources from the IRS would reduce revenue in our cost estimates and in the baseline.
So it would increase the deficit, though, by a significant pop, more than what was originally estimated when it was put forward back in 2022. Because at that point, we were talking about $391 billion, and now we're talking about a higher number. I mean, and I asked that just because in March of 23, just a few months after the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, right, Goldman Sachs came out with a fairly now well-known estimate that the bill's energy subsidies would cost $1.2 trillion. And that was mere months after the initial estimates. So I guess my question is can CBO put some tables together, and would it be helpful with respect to the Inflation Reduction Act about, outside entities like Goldman Sachs, and I think there have been others, that demonstrate the impact fiscally being quite a bit greater than the original $391 billion estimate?
We can do it. I would hesitate to, because it would be like me throwing JCT under the bus. So, I'm not sure I want to make that table so explicit, but all the information is in our budget update, and we've written, I think we've written it clearly, just not quite in the way you said.
What I'm saying with my time expiring is I do think it's important to be that explicit. And it's not about throwing JCT under the bus. It's about Congressional Budget Office helping us budget. It's making that stuff very affirmatively available so we know the numbers. But I yield back with my time.
Mr. Roy, thank you for your comments, and Dr. Swagel for engaging my colleagues, your board of directors. As I've said before, this is a crazy place, Washington. I mean, there's a lack of accountability culturally for the institution in general, and I put Congress at the head of that line. I hope that that's been clear, but we have a responsibility here, and it's not to indict you as culpable for every error in doing your job to score and project impact and economic conditions. It's a very difficult job, I recognize that. But we can't, and I'm hearkening back to the first ranking member's comments about what a great job you all do. There are times when you do a great job, and there are things that need improvement. And to suggest that nothing needs to change, that everything's working out great without exception, is just not realistic for any of us. So I think the members on both sides have identified some good opportunities to work alongside of you and make some statutory changes. I'm just going to highlight a few that are important to me that you and I have talked about. We need better structure on reports. We need a calendar of reports. What you do is critical to our ability to govern our great country, no matter which side of the aisle you sit on. And so in addition to making sure those projections and predictions are accurate, we just need to have all forms and flavors of your analysis manifested in the various reports, and not just the baseline and the updates, although I think we need regular order to include regular updates on a schedule. But whether it's Ms. Ballant in this seat as chair with Democrats in charge, or it's me or one of my Republican colleagues, we ought to have, I think, more certainty and continuity in the information that's flowing to us. I would also suggest that whether you're a Democrat or Republican, we ought to identify some reports that we think would be useful on a regular basis, and not to assume or to put words in anybody's mouth on the my Democrat conference. But for me, improper payments and our ability to get a score that would include or net out the reduction in waste and fraud, I think that's pretty straightforward. Improper payments, waste and fraud should be a bipartisan commitment. So whether we improve on a entitlement program or we expand on it, or whether we, remove it, we should be committed that while it exists where tax dollars are going to the intended good for the public and the intended beneficiary. And I think everybody agrees with that. That's not a partisan statement. But if you score it in a way that doesn't recognize the net benefit of reducing waste and fraud, then it turns out there's not a lot of incentive for members of Congress to put forward their ideas. Does that make sense to you?
No, I agree. You want the information, you want us to get it to you in the way that's useful.
And so these are some things I think that are sensible, straightforward, and I think nonpartisan, but we'll find out. We're going to work through this list because we'll have a hearing to mark these things up. I think the audit, and Mr. Swazi made a good point, I want to emphasize as a result of his comment, I'm not talking about auditing every outcome of every report. I'm simply saying that every organization that's been excellent has had an external and objective review on structure and operations and procedures, and in this case, software and tools. That's in your interest, not just our interest and the American people's interest. It's in your interest to be able to say, we need things that maybe we haven't supported you in the way of resources. In fact, in one comment, I noted that you said that you have modernized, and you mentioned some software on the Social Security side, but you said we've done as much as our budget allows. Well, if we can identify, I think with objectivity, because I think there's always going to be a little bit of suspicion for any agency head coming back asking for more money, and you can get an external validation on some of these things, that may give us greater impetus to collectively, in a bipartisan way, provide the resources so we get this thing closer to accurate. And I know that's your goal. So without going through everything on my list here, I think, I hope my Democrat colleagues will join me. I don't want to do it with just Republicans, but I think a targeted audit in areas that make sense, I think would be responsible as stewards of tax dollars and responsible in support of your mission to support our fellow members of Congress. And then lastly, and this is the burr in my saddle here, gimmicks. Republicans have used them, Ms. Ballant. Democrats have used them. And anytime you give members of Congress a way to wiggle off the altar of accountability and responsibility in fiscal matters, they will, I've learned. If we don't have to do a budget, we won't. If we don't have to do appropriations on time, we won't, right? So we need to close some of those escape hatches and tighten things up on budget gimmicks and accounting gimmicks that would literally have our fellow citizens and constituents with a fine or in prison. And the one that I think of is the rebate rule, where it was never implemented, but it's been used by all sides and all throughout the government operations as a pay for, and it's never even been implemented. So we've never spent any money on it, but we're using it for literally tens of billions of dollars in a pay for. We got to do better on both sides and say, none of this gimmicky stuff. If we need to spend more money, my Democrat colleagues, or raise revenue through taxes, they have to just make that presentation in an intellectually honest way. And if we want to cut spending or cut taxes, we need to make that intellectually honest way. So the better you are at your job, the more intellectually honest our debates are and our conversations, and ultimately, hopefully, we get closer to consensus and we get better at governing. That's my hope. That's the bigger picture here for me. Ms. Ballant, you get the last word, and then we'll close this thing and let Mr. Swagel and his team go back to work.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Swagel, for being here once again. Prior to being in Congress, and before I was in elected office back home in Vermont, I was a teacher. I taught history and I taught government. And one of the things that I've been very alarmed at is the declining confidence that Americans have in government. And 2024 Pew Research Center says, reports that about 22% of Americans believe that they can trust government to do what's right most of the time. Now, as bleak as that is, it's actually up a little bit from 2023, which was record low 16%. So as an American, as a former teacher, as a member of Congress, obviously it's alarming. And so I think it's so important when we take this time in the Budget Committee to hear from you and to be able to convey to Americans that your mission is absolutely nonpartisan, right? And you had said it yourself. You said our team is mission-oriented, fact-based, and not advocacy-based. And I think that's critically important for folks to understand. And as we have talked about today, and as the chair just hinted at as well, that you are a very small congressional support agency. We ask you to do a lot of work on our behalf. We want to make sure that you have the resources you need to do your work, because your work helps us to do our work better. And as I think we all know, predicting the future is incredibly difficult, right? And I do believe the CBO's track record overall has been shown to be more accurate than other expert organizations, and that is to your credit and the folks that are working with you. It's work and analysis like this that's critical to us being able to do our work in this committee. So I very much appreciate that. And again, I do see some of the work that I have to do as a member of Congress as to do my level best to try to reinstill faith in government and the work of government, because we are here to work on behalf of the people. And for nearly 50 years, the budget committees and Congress have relied on the CBO's independent, nonpartisan analysis. I think that gets lost sometimes, that we actually have offices that are charged with giving us the information we need. And as we've said here today, sometimes my side likes the way that you're reporting something. Sometimes the other side is frustrated with you, how you're scoring something. But that is critical work of government. So I think the last thing that I would say is we need to return to a time of regular order. And you have said this as well, Mr. Chair, because that is what enables people to trust in a true, transparent appropriations process. And again, I thank you for the work of the CBO to help us do that. It's not just good for the work that we're doing here in this committee, it's better for Congress, but ultimately, it's better for the American people. So thank you so much for your time, and I know you'll be back again, and you're always well prepared, and I very much appreciate that.
Thank you.
Well, what do you think? You think we ought to get a new ranking member? I'm pretty convinced at this point. I'm going to give Greg Lopez Freshman Member of the Year, and I'm going to go read the Budget Act again for how I get a new ranking member. No, if Brendan Boyle from Pennsylvania is listening, we hope he gets to feeling better. And I suspect that while he says his voice is out and he might be under the weather, it may have something to do with that Northern Illinois defeat of the Fighting Irish. I just think I know him by now better than he thinks. Thanks for your time again, and well said, and let's keep working towards the goals that we believe are mutually beneficial to us in the room and to those folks watching back home who we're all working for. I do have to, before I didn't hit the gavel, so we're still on clock. Without objection, I'd like to submit this record, for the record, a paper written by Demian Brady, Vice President of Research for the National Taxpayers Union Foundation, outlining key reforms to improve the effectiveness of the Congressional Budget Office. So ordered, and now we're adjourned.